Hello and welcome back. It's Music History with Grout. We're in chapter 27. We're looking at the second half of chapter 27, which is mid-century, mid-1800s opera and music theater. This is the second half of this series, and so it's going to be kind of short. We're going to get to the point and go from there. So a couple of the things that we'll listen to bits and pieces of for this. Remember that when we were working on it the other day, we were looking mostly at Italian, excuse me, Italian opera. As we move into French opera, and because it's mid 1800s, mid 19th century, we have the effects of the Napoleon's king emperorship, we'll call it, and still some residual stuff going on from what he was doing. In Paris, one of the things that Napoleon's crew did was to build a really great couple of opera houses in Paris. But they were kind of restrictive in what the people could sing, and they edited some of the material. So opera, in a sense, was kind of a political tool in France, in Paris. And you remember that he finally got defeated. He died. So Napoleon died 1815 or 16, or maybe a little bit later than that. And then he had cousins and brothers and kids that took over for a while. Finally, in the Revolution of 1830, they've accomplished what they had started to set out to do back in 1796. So you've gotten your piece of paper and your pen, or you've opened up an email and you're going to write down a couple of things, maybe three. And the first thing that I'd like for you to write down is just that the French Revolution, although it started in the late 1700s, went through about 1830, ending with the July Revolution. So basically making a note of the length of the French Revolution. Now, truth be told, it pops up again in 1848. But a lot of people don't pay much attention to that. So we're not going to. What did I do? Come back. Okay. The French opera designed to appeal to the well-to-do middle class. Remember that we're starting to have the rise of the middle class because of the Industrial Revolution, because of the shift from an agrarian culture, because of the Industrial Revolution, people moving into the city to work in factories. And what happened then is that because people were coming in and working in the factories, really creating a workday, then other people built up the supports for that. Like certain people then were the farmers, and certain people were the bakers, and certain people were cooking dinners, and we began to see individual businesses pop up. Up until the late 1700s, early 1800s, you pretty much took care of everything yourself. You might be able to buy some clothing somewhere, maybe buy some shoes, but you made your own clothes, you grew your own food, you made your own bread. It was pretty much every man for himself. It's kind of a stretch, but you get the idea. So that during the Industrial Revolution, we saw businesses begin to emerge and a middle class arising out of that. And that's all part of the whole effects of the century before the Enlightenment in the 1700s. All right, so several French people we ended our last session talking about and listening to a little bit of an opera by Rossini, William Tell. Rossini started out in Italy and finished up in Paris, in France, and the William Tell was performed primarily in the French houses, and then Anglicanized, put up into the English area as well. Giacomo Meyerbeer is another not famous opera composer, but he did some really interesting ones. And one of those was the Huguenots, which is a 5-act thing that incorporates ballet, dramatic scenery, lighting effects. Oh my gosh, some of the things that are happening as they build these new opera houses, they're putting in flying set things. So if you've ever been on a stage production, or if you've ever worked backstage, you know that there's this whole system of ropes and pulleys and bars, and they can make scenes go up and down with that stuff. And it's quite complex now. All of that was starting here in the ballet in the mid 1800s, where they would do these elaborate staging things. And the Huguenots by Meyerbeer is an example of that. It's written about the events of the St. Bartholomew's Massacre, which was the massacre of anywhere from 2,000 to 50,000, depending on who you talk to, Huguenots, which are French Calvin Protestants, French Calvinistic Protestants in the Paris area. It's a really complex story, but it's kind of the epitome of the conflict that's going on between the Protestants and the Catholics. And we've talked about that in previous classes, not going to spend much time on that, but St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, the subject of this opera, provides opportunity for some really intense settings. Okay, so in our last session, we talked a little bit about the opera comique and the opera seria, and how one of the things that Rossini did was to combine the two ideas, opera comique being comedy operas, of opera seria being serious. Incidentally, while I'm saying this word opera, and I'm reminded of reading in a devotional recently that it wasn't really the part of the devotional, but I was reading some of the rubrics, and the opera something, it was the works of something, and it just occurred. I mean, it makes sense that the word opera originally was works, works, the works of something or other, and has devolved into, or evolved into, not devolved, evolved into this idea of an opera being the combining of all these works into a piece that we present. All right, so did I skip it? Oh, it's next. Okay. Berlioz wrote this. Hector Berlioz. I'm sorry, I didn't finish that thought. Hector Berlioz was around. Where is his name? Oh my gosh. We talked about him the other day, and we're going to talk about him again. So we're not going to worry right now what his dates are. But he wrote the Troyen, Le Troyen, in 1856 to 1858. If you look on Wikipedia, there's an interesting story that he wrote about the writing of this piece. Now, the 1856, he was not in great health. And over the course of the 2 years, his health deteriorated. He wrote the opera, but he died before it ever got performed. And so, as an in its entirety, it was performed in late 1858, but he was not able to see it. 5-act opera, which is rare. Most operas are 3 acts long. Emphasis on the long. In this one of the stories, he wrote this and included ballet in the opera. And originally, his second scene or his second act was supposed to be just all ballet set on a riverbank. And the scene change took about an hour to perform because he wanted it performed with running water on a stage. So in order to affect that, they had to bring out this part of the scene change was to bring out the whole river trough, and he was going to be pumping water from the Seine River and putting it through the stage. Well, budgets and timing and all kinds of problems with that. So that didn't ever make it into the final draft, but it was his idea. It was going to be a grand and epic story. Okay, so Le Troyen. Here, let me give you somebody who can actually say that word. Here you go. That word right there.
Le Troyen.
There you go. Le Troyen. Okay, so that is the Trojans. And this opera is about that story by Virgil, Aeneid. Where's my wife when I need her? Aeneid. And it's the story of the Trojan horse. And you've probably heard that at some point in your life. The 5th act begins with this song. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on in here, and we're just going to listen a little bit of Valence Sonore from the Trojans by Berlioz. This is a tenor singing, opening the final act, and he's on his ship, looking to and wishing, reminiscing about being home, wanting to go home. So we'll just listen to a little bit. We're listening to Berlioz and his Let you listen to him in the background a little bit. So this is the opening of the fifth act, and this, I think it's a Phrygian guy. Um, the whole story that Virgil wrote is much more than just the Trojan horse. And so this is later in the story after they've had the conflict and the Phrygians have come and conquered some people. And you see the staging. This is kind of sparse for operatic staging because it's done in modern days, and frequently in modern opera will use what's called suggestive staging. And in fact, let's just make that the second thing that you write down. An alternative type of staging that is done rather than just trying to make a realistic staging is called suggestive staging. So just write down the words suggestive staging for me, and I'll know that you've watched this far. Thank you. Suggestive of standing on the mast of the ship in the what's called the pigeon's nest. And he's singing. It's going to show up a couple of other ship people, sailors are going to show up in just a little bit. We won't get that far. But you heard a very simple orchestral background. Remember that as we move into the mid-century, the orchestra is coming into more prominence in terms of shaping emotion. It's not being left up just to the singers. The last of the 1700s was the emphasis on the singers, the early 1800s, and the early two sailors. But the emphasis on the singers is shifting to a more balanced approach, and the orchestra having more to play. Let's see if these guys are singing yet. I am sure. Oh, you know what comes to mind as we enter the Easter season coming up is and I don't know the text, so I don't know the sailors, the soldiers playing, casting lots at the foot of the cross. Who knows? Well, I certainly don't know, but we're going to stop with that right now and move on. Skip it, big brother. I want to see you again. Stop. All right. So French, we go on opera comique, and then the incorporation of ballet, and all of this stuff you see here. Ballet introduced by Marie Taglioni. The libretto, when you do an opera, you have the singing part, the words, and that is called a libretto. It's just text. It's not music, not notes. It's just the words that are going to be said. And that libretto is written by somebody. In the case of Le Troyon, Berlioz actually wrote the libretto himself. But usually a libretto is written by somebody who's more of a word crafter. And then the composer writes the music to go with the libretto. And then the staging guy, I don't remember what he's called, comes up with the staging design. When they incorporate ballet, they bring in a whole nother person to choreograph all of the ballet. So it's really a group effort of people. We see this in the next century with some really great collaborations of some modern staging. I can't wait to get there. We're not going to get there today, though. So Giselle, the Paris Opera. Okay, so opera's going on all over the place. Germany, Karl Maria von Weber, Der Fritzenschütz, a free shooter. We're not going to listen to much German opera. We might hear one piece in just a minute. By the way, as a guy, Karl Maria von Weber is a young man, 1786 to 1826. And we're going to watch from that opera that I just mentioned a minute ago, the final scene of Act 2, the Wolf's Glen scene, and listen to the language specifically. Remember in our last video, the discussion about the nice open valves of Italian opera and the syllabic, syllables of the consonants in German. Listen to a little bit of the Wolfsglen scene by Weber, Carl Maria von Weber. Turn the sound back up.
Ich kann nicht hinab. Hast du Herz liegt ja sonst wie eine Gänse. Sieh dorthin, sieh. Was dort sich weiß, ist meiner Mutter Geist. So lag sie im Saal, so ruht sie im Grab.
Orchestra in this German orchestra participating in really dramatic moments, and then smoothing that out when the ghost and another floats across. And the orchestra is really taking on the role of guiding the emotions, guiding the action. So you're not just relying on the text. It's a good thing because most of us don't speak German or Italian or French. It's dramatic, it's exciting.
Ich denke wohl auch, dass du musst. Hier bin ich. Was habe ich zu tun?
Now, there you have some speaking. And this is when we start to see dialogue in the form of speaking as opposed to singing. Opera up until now has been just singing. And this move, part of this chapter is musical theater. And this is kind of the beginning of today's musical theaters where we have a lot of dialogue and then special songs and choruses. But it's this speaking that's going on now in the mid-1800s with Carl Maria von Weber's.
Das rechte Auge eines Wiedehopfs. Das linke eines Luchses. Probatum est.
Probatum.
Und nun der Kugelsegen.
All right, a blessing on the bullets. We're going to leave it at that. And you can go back and watch that if you want to sometime later on. All right. So he wrote a lot of stuff, but what he really does with these things is sets up some of the composers that are to come. Not in this session, but in another session next week or following, we start talking about, oh gosh, guy that came up with so much stuff. Wagner, the German composer Wagner. Oh my gosh, how can I forget? And you'll hear, when you hear Wagner, it's reminiscent of some of the things that von Weber is doing just a few years before Wagner's born. Russia has its own set of things going on. St. Petersburg, at this point, it was where the imperial court spends its summers. And they have, they're not going to spend much time on this, but they have Catherine is one of the Tsarist, Tsarist. So that's the wife of the Tsar. And Catherine is French. I'm pretty sure that she's French, but she comes there and she brings all of these ideologies of great art. So when I was in Russia back in the early 2000s, there were a lot of Russian words that I heard that I thought they were speaking French at times because it just sounded more French than Russian. But that's the influence of Catherine, and she brought with that not only the French ideas, but some of the Italian ideas as well. So Russia, at this point in the mid-1800s, is really kind of reflecting some of the other countries around it. But not part of that, we talked about last week that the idea of nationalism and how countries are starting to be formed as countries. There's still a lot of kings and queens and princes and all those kinds floating around. We haven't gotten rid of those. We still haven't gotten rid of those today. Just, we see Harry and Margaret, or Markle, whatever Markle's name is, in the news all the time. Okay, so Glinka, I love just saying Glinka. Don't know what he's saying. Life for the Tsar was one of his things. Ruslan and Lyudmila, a couple of great things. In the United States, mentioned this the other day briefly, opera is popular in the United States. This is a common form of entertainment. We don't have TVs yet, don't have radios. People got to do something with their evenings. They go to the opera. They go to the show. I mentioned the other day that there's an opera house. There was an opera house in Shawnee where my wife grew up, and it's still there in some form or another. But for that third and final question, just go ahead and jot down Shawnee as the place where in Oklahoma there was an opera house in the late 1800s. Very, very late, because we weren't even a state at that point. Early 1900s, turn of the century, Shawnee, Oklahoma. And there you go. Now I'll know that you've stuck with me the entire way. Minstrel shows, which we're not going to spend a lot of time on, were a part of that rise of things. We'll when we look at the jazz movement, we'll come back and look a little bit about some of the seeds of that in the Jim Crow style music with the minstrel shows and things that are going on at that time. Stephen Foster is one of those guys who is one of our own composers. Oh, Susanna, oh, don't you cry for me. Camptown Races. I don't remember how it goes. On my old Kentucky home. I don't remember how it goes, but it's a Stephen Foster song that was popular around that time. So that's really some of the seeds of what's going on in the United States for opera is as early as the middle 1800s. There's a lot of stuff there. I encourage you to read those things, watch this, send me your cards and letters, or at least your email or piece of paper, and close the check. Kidding. All right, have a great weekend.